The hammering on the door came before dawn, hard enough to shake the thin wooden frame of the house. Elena Voss shot up from her mattress, heart slamming against her ribs, and for one terrible second, she thought the roof was caving in. Then she heard the voices outside, low and rough, and she understood the sound was made by fists, not falling wood. She was already moving before she had time to think, pulling a shawl over her shoulders, stepping into the hallway where her father stood frozen, like a man watching his own house burn. Gerald Voss had not slept in days. She could see it in the gray hollows under his eyes, in the way his hands trembled when he reached for the door latch. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't open it." "They'll break it down if I don't," he said, and his voice cracked in a way she had never heard before, not even when her mother died 3 winters ago. The door swung open, and 3 men filled the doorway, blocking out what little moonlight remained. Their leader was tall, dressed in a long dark coat despite the warm night, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he already knows he has won. "Gerald," the man said pleasantly, as if greeting an old friend at a market stall. "You have had 2 months. I gave you 2 months out of respect for your late wife. That respect has a price, and the price has now expired. I need more time, Victor. Please. I can get the money. I just need time," Victor Kane repeated, tasting the word like it amused him. "You said that 8 weeks ago. You said it 4 weeks ago. I am not a patient man by nature, Gerald, but I have tried very hard to be patient with you." Elena stepped forward, placing herself slightly in front of her father, without quite meaning to. "How much does he owe you?" Victor's eyes moved to her for the first time, and something in his expression shifted, sharpened, the way a fox notices a rabbit has wandered too close to the open field. He studied her face, her figure, the way she held herself even now, frightened but not broken. 40,000, he said slowly, still looking at her. "Plus interest. Call it 45. Gerald made a sound like he had been struck. "That's impossible. I don't have—" "I know exactly what you don't have," Victor said, cutting him off without raising his voice, which somehow made the words more frightening than shouting would have. "I have seen your ledgers, Gerald. I have seen your empty grain stores, and your unpaid workers, and your mortgaged land. You have nothing left to give me." He paused, and the pause stretched long enough that Elena felt the walls of the house pressing in around her. "Nothing," Victor said again, "except her." The words landed like ice water down Elena's spine. For a moment nobody moved. Her father's face went the color of old paper, and he stepped forward, positioning his body between Elena and the 3 men crowding the doorway. "No," he said. "Absolutely not. I will find another way." "You have had 8 weeks to find another way," Victor said, and now there was steel underneath the pleasant tone, a blade wrapped in silk. "There is no other way left, Gerald. You know it, and I know it. Your daughter is young, healthy, and by all accounts obedient. There are people who pay very well for exactly that combination." Elena's stomach turned. She had heard whispers about this before. Stories passed between neighbors in hushed voices about families who disappeared in the night, about daughters and sons who were never seen again after their fathers fell too deep into debt. She had always thought those stories belonged to other villages, other families, never her own quiet corner of the territory where her mother had planted roses along the fence, and her father had once been a respected grain merchant, before 3 bad harvests broke him. "You can't do this," she said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded, even as her hands shook at her sides. "I am not property. I am not something you can trade like grain or livestock." Victor tilted his head, considering her, the way a man considers a puzzle that has suddenly become more interesting than he expected. "No," he agreed. "You are something considerably more valuable than grain or livestock, which is precisely why this arrangement will settle your father's entire debt, and why you should be thanking me for offering such generous terms." "Get out of my house," Gerald said, finding some last reserve of courage. "Get out, both of you, before I—" One of Victor's men moved so fast that Elena barely saw it happen. A hand closed around her father's collar and slammed him back against the wall, hard enough that a framed photograph of her mother crashed to the floor, and the glass shattered across the boards. "Father." Elena rushed forward, but the second man caught her by the arm, his grip like iron, and held her back while she struggled uselessly against him. "Let him go," she said, twisting against the hold. Please, let him go. I'll listen. Just let him go. Victor raised one hand, and the man released Gerald, who slid down the wall and sat gasping on the floor, one hand pressed to his throat. Elena pulled free of the man holding her, and dropped to her knees beside her father, checking his face, his neck, terrified she would find blood. He'll live, Victor said, sounding almost bored by the whole exchange, as if violence were simply a tool he used when conversation moved too slowly. For now, at least. Whether he continues to live comfortably depends entirely on what happens in the next few minutes. Elena helped her father sit up against the wall, his breath ragged, his eyes wet with something that looked like shame more than pain. She turned back to face Victor, and for the first time in her life she understood what it meant to feel truly cornered, the way an animal feels when the last path of escape closes behind it. "What do you want?" she said, though she already suspected the answer. "There is an event," Victor said, straightening his coat as though the earlier violence had never happened. "A private gathering, 3 nights from now, where certain arrangements are made between families with debts and buyers with means. You will attend. You will be presented. Whatever price is paid will clear your father's account in full, and he will never hear from me again. And if I refuse?" Victor's smile did not waver, but something colder moved behind his eyes. "Then I take your father instead, and I promise you the men who buy him will not be nearly as generous as the ones who might buy you. Or perhaps I simply burn this house down around both of you and collect what I can from the ashes. There are many ways this can end, Elena. Only one of them ends with your father alive and free of me." The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour, though it could not have been more than a few seconds. Elena looked at her father, who would not meet her eyes. His shoulders curled inward, with a grief so heavy, it seemed to be crushing him from the inside. "Elena," he whispered. "Don't. Whatever you're thinking, don't. I would rather he take everything I own. I would rather he take my life than let him touch a single hair on your head. You don't have a choice in this anymore," she said quietly, and the words tasted like ash in her mouth even as she spoke them. "None of us do." She turned back to Victor, straightening her spine, refusing to let him see how badly her legs wanted to give out beneath her. 3 nights from now, I'll be there. But you leave this house alone. You leave my father alone, starting now." Victor studied her for a long moment, and something like approval flickered across his sharp features. "You have more spine than your father, I'll give you that. It's a shame spine doesn't pay debts." He gestured to his men, and they moved toward the door as smoothly as they had arrived. Predators who had gotten exactly what they came for. At the threshold, Victor paused and looked back over his shoulder. "Wear something presentable," he said. "First impressions matter a great deal in this particular business." The door closed behind them, and the house fell into a silence so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her father began to weep then, silent broken sobs that shook his whole body, and she knelt beside him and held him, the way he had once held her when she was small and frightened of thunderstorms. Except this storm had no end in sight, and there was no comfort she could offer that would make it pass. "I'm sorry," he kept saying, over and over. "I'm so sorry, Elena. This is my failure, not yours. You shouldn't have to pay for my mistakes." She did not answer right away. She sat with him on the cold floor, among the broken glass and the fallen photograph of her mother's smiling face, and she let herself feel the fear for exactly as long as it took to breathe through it. Then she pushed it down, folded it away somewhere she could not afford to look at it, because falling apart would not save her father, and it would not save this house, and it would not undo whatever was coming in 3 days. "We'll get through this," she said, though she had no idea how that could possibly be true. Somehow, we'll get through it. Outside, the first gray light of morning was beginning to touch the horizon, and somewhere far beyond the borders of their quiet village, in territory Elena had never seen and could not have imagined, a man who ruled over more power than she could comprehend was about to receive word of an auction that would change the course of his life as thoroughly as it would change hers. For the next 3 days, Elena moved through the house like a ghost, rehearsing for her own disappearance. She mended the one good dress she owned, a pale blue thing her mother had sewn years ago for a wedding that never happened because the groom's family backed out at the last moment. She packed nothing, because Victor's men had made it clear she would be given whatever she needed once the arrangement was finalized, and the thought of that phrase, whatever she needed, once the arrangement was finalized, made her stomach twist every time it crossed her mind. Her father tried everything he could think of in those 3 days. He visited neighbors he had not spoken to in years, hoping for a loan that never materialized. He walked to the next town over and back, blistering his feet, chasing a rumor about a distant cousin who might have money to spare. Nothing came of any of it. The debt was too large, the timeline too short, and everyone in the village knew better than to cross a man like Victor Kane. On the second night, Elena sat by her mother's grave, in the small plot behind the house, the roses her mother had planted now, overgrown and wild around the headstone. She talked to the grave the way she used to when she was younger, telling her mother everything that had happened, everything that was coming, as if speaking it aloud to the cold earth might somehow lighten the weight pressing on her chest. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words barely a whisper in the dark. "I don't know what's waiting for me at that gathering. I don't know if I'll ever see this house again, or father, or anything I've ever known, but I know I can't let him take everything from us. Not when I can stop it." The wind moved through the roses, and for a moment Elena imagined it was her mother's hand brushing against her cheek, though she knew that was only grief playing tricks on a tired mind. She stayed there until the cold drove her back inside, and she slept that night with a strange, hollow calm, the calm of someone who has already accepted the shape of the thing they cannot avoid. The third night arrived faster than she expected. Victor's men returned at dusk, this time with a covered carriage waiting on the road outside the house. Her father stood on the porch, refusing to say goodbye, because goodbye felt too final. And instead, he simply held her for a long time, his arms trembling around her shoulders. "If there was any other way," he whispered against her hair, "I would have found it. I want you to know that. I searched every possibility, and there was nothing. Nothing except this." "I know," Elena said, and she meant it, because whatever anger she carried belonged to Victor Kane and the world that allowed men like him to exist, not to her father, who had spent 3 sleepless days trying to save her, and failed only because the world had given him no room to succeed. "Whatever happens," her father continued, pulling back to look at her face, memorizing it the way a man memorizes something he fears he may never see again, "you are stronger than you know. Your mother was the same way. She never let anything break her, not truly, not down to the core of who she was. You have that same strength in you, Elena. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and one of Victor's men stepped forward to open the carriage door, his patience clearly running thin. Elena kissed her father's cheek, climbed into the carriage without looking back, because she knew if she looked back she would lose whatever fragile courage she had managed to hold together, and the door closed behind her with a sound that felt disturbingly final. The carriage rattled down the road, carrying her away from everything familiar, toward a gathering she could not picture, and a fate she could not predict. She pressed her palm against the small window, watching the outline of her house grow smaller and smaller in the darkness, until it disappeared entirely behind the trees, swallowed by the night. She did not know, as the carriage carried her deeper into unfamiliar territory, that the man who would soon change everything about her life was, at that very moment, standing at the edge of a shadowed forest many miles away, listening to a report from one of his most trusted men about a private auction that had drawn the attention of the crown itself. She did not know that her name, still unknown to him, was already written on a short list of concerns that had reached the desk of a ruler few people had ever seen with their own eyes. She knew only the rattle of wheels beneath her, the tightness in her chest, and the growing certainty that whatever waited for her at the end of this road would either destroy what remained of her old life, or force her to become someone entirely new. The carriage rounded a final bend, and through the small window, Elena caught her first glimpse of the estate where the gathering would take place, its windows glowing gold against the black night, like 100 watching eyes. She took a slow breath, steadying herself as best she could, and reminded herself of the promise she had made 3 nights ago, kneeling among broken glass on her own living room floor. "We'll get through this." She was about to find out exactly how true, or how impossible, those words might be. The carriage stopped in front of a grand stone building, its windows lit with warm light that did nothing to soften the cold dread pooling in Elena's stomach. A man in a dark suit opened the door and offered his hand, and she stepped down onto gravel that crunched beneath her worn shoes, feeling suddenly, painfully aware of how out of place she looked among the polished carriages and finely dressed guests moving toward the entrance. Inside, the building revealed itself to be less a home and more a hall, built for spectacle. Tall columns lined a wide room, and a raised platform stood at the far end, lit by rows of candles that made the whole space feel like a stage set for a performance nobody had asked to watch. Elena was led, along with a handful of other young women and a few young men, into a smaller side chamber where an older woman, with cold, efficient hands, helped her change into a gown that had clearly been provided for exactly this purpose. "Stand straight," the woman instructed, tugging at the fabric without any warmth in her voice. "Chin up, don't slouch, don't look at your feet, don't speak unless spoken to. The buyers appreciate composure." Elena said nothing, though every instinct in her body wanted to refuse, to run, to do anything, except stand still, while a stranger arranged her like a piece of furniture meant for sale. She caught her own reflection in a tall mirror against the wall, and barely recognized the young woman staring back, dressed in silk the color of deep wine, her dark hair pinned up in a style she had never worn before. She looked, she thought bitterly, exactly like what she was about to become: a product, an arrangement, a debt paid in flesh. Beside her, a younger girl, perhaps 16 at most, stood trembling so badly that her teeth chattered audibly in the quiet room. Elena reached over without thinking and took the girl's hand. "What's your name?" she whispered. "Clara," the girl breathed, barely audible. "I'm Elena. Stay close to me if you can. We'll get through tonight." Clara nodded, though the fear in her eyes did not fade. Elena squeezed her hand once, wishing she could offer more than words, wishing there was anything at all she could do to change what was about to happen to either of them. They were led out in a line, one by one, onto the raised platform beneath the candlelight, while the crowd below murmured and shifted and watched with the detached interest of people evaluating livestock at a country fair. Elena had never felt so exposed in her life, every eye in the room measuring her, weighing her, deciding what she might be worth. Victor Kane stood near the front of the platform, presiding over the proceedings with the same pleasant, dangerous smile he had worn in her father's doorway 3 nights ago. When her turn came, he stepped forward and placed a light hand on her shoulder, guiding her to the center of the stage, as though introducing a prized piece of art. "Elena Voss," he announced to the room, his voice carrying easily over the murmuring crowd. 22 years old, in excellent health, well-mannered, and quick-minded. Her father's debt stands at 45,000. Bidding begins at that figure. For a moment nobody moved, and Elena allowed herself a flicker of hope that perhaps no one in this room would want to pay such a sum for her. Then a man near the back raised his hand, calling out a number, and another voice countered it moments later, and the room seemed to come alive with a hunger that made Elena's skin crawl. She kept her eyes fixed on a point above the heads of the crowd, refusing to let her fear show, refusing to give any of them the satisfaction of watching her break. The numbers climbed steadily, faster than Elena could track, and she caught fragments of conversation drifting up from the crowd, comments about her appearance, her posture, speculation about what use she might be put to once purchased. She forced herself not to listen too closely, focusing instead on breathing, on staying upright, on surviving one moment and then the next. Then, from somewhere near the back of the hall, a figure detached itself from the shadows along the far wall. He wore a dark hooded cloak that obscured most of his face, and he moved through the crowd with an ease that made people step aside without seeming to notice they were doing it, as though some instinct older than conscious thought told them to clear a path. 100,000, the hooded figure said, and his voice, though quiet, seemed to fill the entire hall, silencing every other conversation instantly. The room went utterly still. Even Victor Kane, who had clearly seen every manner of wealthy buyer pass through his auctions, blinked in obvious surprise before recovering his composure. 100,000, Victor repeated, testing the number as though he doubted his own ears. A generous offer. Does anyone care to challenge it? Silence answered him. Nobody in the room, it seemed, was willing to bid against the hooded figure, and Elena noticed that several people near him had actually taken a step back, putting distance between themselves and the stranger as though his presence alone carried some kind of warning. They all understood instinctively, even if Elena did not. "Sold," Victor announced, and something in his voice carried a note of relief that puzzled Elena even through her fear. "The young woman goes to our generous benefactor at the back of the hall." Elena was led down from the platform on unsteady legs, her mind racing through everything this could mean. 100,000 was more than double what her father owed. Why would anyone pay so much more than necessary? What kind of buyer had that kind of wealth to spend so freely? And why did the entire room seem to shrink away from him without a single word being exchanged? The hooded man waited near a side door, and as she approached, he lowered his hood just enough for her to catch a glimpse of sharp, angular features, and eyes that seemed to catch the candlelight in a way that felt distinctly unnatural. A faint gleam that reminded her, absurdly, of an animal's eyes reflecting light in the dark. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and even. "You are no longer required to remain here." "Who are you?" Elena asked, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the way her pulse hammered in her throat. "Someone who has settled your father's debt in full," he answered, which was not really an answer at all. "The details can wait. Right now, we should leave this place." He gestured toward the door, and Elena hesitated only a moment before following, some instinct telling her that whatever waited outside this hall was preferable to whatever might happen if she remained among the crowd a moment longer. As she passed the small side chamber, she caught sight of Clara being led toward the platform, and their eyes met briefly across the room. Elena wanted to stop, wanted to do something, anything, to help the frightened girl, but the hooded man's hand settled lightly at her back, guiding her firmly toward the exit. "I'm sorry," Elena murmured toward Clara, though she doubted the girl could hear her over the noise of the crowd. "I'm so sorry." Outside, the night air felt shockingly cold after the heat of the crowded hall. A carriage waited, sleek and unmarked, far grander than the one that had brought her here. The hooded man opened the door himself, an oddly humble gesture for someone who had just spent a fortune to claim her, and Elena climbed inside, her legs finally giving out slightly as she sank onto the cushioned seat. He settled across from her, pulling back his hood fully now that they were away from the crowd. In the dim lantern light of the carriage interior, she could see him clearly for the first time. A man perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair, a strong jaw, and those strange, striking eyes that seemed to hold something far older and far more guarded than his youthful face suggested. "You have questions," he said. "Not quite a question itself." "I have several dozen," Elena admitted, "starting with your name, since you seem to know mine already." "Damien," he said simply. "Damien Ashgrove." "And why Damien Ashgrove? Would you pay double what my father owed to a man who was about to sell me like cattle?" Something flickered across his expression, too quick for her to name, gone before she could study it further. "Because the sum needed to be large enough that no one else in that room would dare challenge it," he said, "and because Victor Kane needed to understand, clearly and without ambiguity, that the woman he sold tonight now belongs to interests far above his own." "Belongs," Elena repeated, the words settling like a stone in her chest. "So I am still property then? Just property with a wealthier owner?" Damien's gaze sharpened, and for a moment the carriage felt smaller, the air between them charged with something Elena could not quite identify. "You are not property," he said, and there was an edge in his voice now, quiet but unmistakable. "You are under my protection. There is a considerable difference, and you will understand that difference clearly before this night is finished." Elena studied him, searching his face for some sign of deception, some crack in his composed exterior that might reveal his true intentions. She found nothing but calm, steady certainty, the kind of confidence that came from a man rarely questioned and even less rarely defied. "Protection from what?" she asked. "From Victor Kane? My father's debt is settled now. What further danger could there possibly be?" "That," Damien said, turning his gaze toward the small window as the carriage began to move, carrying them away from the auction hall and into the dark countryside beyond, "is a longer conversation, and one better suited for daylight, when you have rested and eaten and are less likely to think me entirely mad." Elena wanted to press further, wanted answers now rather than later, but exhaustion was beginning to overtake the adrenaline that had carried her through the auction. She sank back against the cushioned seat, watching the dark shapes of trees blur past the window, and allowed herself, for the first time in 3 days, to breathe without the immediate threat of violence hanging over her head. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly. "Somewhere safe," Damien said. "Somewhere you will have time to understand exactly what has happened tonight, and what it means for both of us going forward." The carriage rolled on through the darkness, carrying Elena further from everything she had known, and deeper into a world she could not yet imagine, while across from her, Damien Ashgrove watched her with an expression she could not read, a man carrying secrets far larger than the sum he had spent to claim her freedom. Elena must have drifted into a light, uneasy sleep at some point during the long ride, because the next thing she knew, the carriage was slowing, wheels crunching over a different kind of gravel, smoother, and more carefully maintained than the path leading to the auction hall. She blinked awake to find Damien watching her with the same unreadable expression he had worn for most of the journey, though something in his posture seemed slightly less guarded now, as though the darkness of the carriage had allowed him to lower some invisible wall, if only a little. "We've arrived," he said, and there was no mistaking the faint note of caution in his voice, the tone of a man preparing someone for a sight they were not fully ready to see. The carriage door opened, and Elena stepped out into cool night air, scented with pine, and something else she could not immediately place, something wild and clean, that reminded her, absurdly, of standing at the edge of a deep forest at dusk. What stretched before her was not the modest house she had expected, but an enormous estate, its stone walls rising 3 stories high, flanked by towers at either end, and surrounded by grounds so vast she could not see where they ended in the darkness. Guards stood at intervals along the main entrance, dressed in dark uniforms, their postures rigid and alert in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of soldiers rather than household staff. As Damien approached, each guard straightened further, several inclining their heads in a gesture that looked less like simple respect, and more like something closer to reverence, the kind of deference offered to royalty rather than to a wealthy landowner. "This way," Damien said, offering no explanation for the strange behavior of his guards, and Elena followed him up a wide set of stone steps into a grand entrance hall, lit by rows of hanging lanterns. Inside, the estate revealed itself to be even larger than its exterior suggested. High ceilings arched overhead, decorated with carved wooden beams. Portraits lined the walls of the main hallway, though Elena noticed none of them included dates or clear identifying names, only stern, striking faces that seemed to watch her pass with quiet judgment. Everything about the place spoke of old wealth and older power, the kind that did not need to announce itself because it had never once been questioned. A woman appeared from a side corridor, older, with silver threaded through dark hair pulled into a neat bun, dressed in clothing far finer than any household servant Elena had ever seen. She bowed her head slightly toward Damien, before turning her attention to Elena, studying her with an expression that held equal parts curiosity and calculation. "This is Elena," Damien said. "She will be staying with us. See that a room is prepared, and that she has everything she needs." "Of course," the woman said smoothly, though her eyes lingered on Elena a moment longer than seemed necessary. "I'm Margaret. I oversee the household here. If you require anything at all, you have only to ask." "Thank you," Elena said, still trying to reconcile the grandeur around her with the terrifying uncertainty of the last 3 days. Margaret led her up a wide staircase and down a long corridor to a room that took Elena's breath away, not because it was excessive, but because it was simply, quietly beautiful. Decorated in soft blues and warm wood tones, with a large window overlooking dark gardens below. A fire already crackled in the hearth, chasing away the chill of the long carriage ride. "Rest tonight," Margaret said, setting out a simple nightgown on the bed. "There will be time for questions tomorrow. For now, you've had a very long day, and this house has a way of feeling less strange once the sun comes up." Elena thanked her, though she doubted anything about her situation would feel less strange in daylight. Once alone, she moved to the window and pressed her palm against the cool glass, looking out at grounds she could barely make out in the darkness, wondering what kind of man commanded guards who bowed to him, servants who spoke of him with careful respect, and an estate large enough to rival anything she had only ever heard about in stories. She thought of her father, alone now in their small house, hopefully sleeping easier knowing his debt had been cleared, though she wondered if he would ever learn the true circumstances of how it happened. She thought of Clara, the frightened girl from the auction, and hoped whoever had purchased her had shown even a fraction of whatever strange decency Damien seemed to possess. Sleep came eventually, heavy and dreamless, and Elena woke the next morning to soft daylight filtering through the curtains and the distant sound of birds outside her window. For a disoriented moment, she forgot where she was, expecting the familiar cracked ceiling of her childhood bedroom. Then memory returned in a rush, and she sat up quickly, taking in the unfamiliar room around her with fresh eyes. A knock sounded at the door, and a young maid entered carrying a tray of food, along with a simple but well-made dress laid over her arm. "Good morning, miss. Margaret thought you might like breakfast before meeting with Master Damien." "Master Damien," Elena repeated, turning the title over in her mind. "Is that what everyone calls him?" The maid's expression flickered, something like nervousness passing behind her eyes. "It's one of the things we call him, yes. Please, eat. He'll be waiting in the East Garden whenever you're ready." Elena ate quickly, curiosity outweighing her lingering unease, and changed into the dress provided, simple and comfortable compared to the elaborate gown from the night before. She found her way through the winding corridors to a set of glass doors that opened onto a garden bathed in morning light, roses climbing along stone trellises in a way that reminded her achingly of her mother's small garden back home. Damien stood near a stone fountain at the garden's center, his back to her, watching the water catch the sunlight. He turned as she approached, and in the clear light of morning, Elena could study him properly for the first time. He looked, she thought, entirely ordinary in daylight, handsome in a sharp, understated way, dressed simply, despite the obvious wealth surrounding him. Nothing about his appearance explained the strange behavior of his household the night before. "You slept well, I hope," he said. "Well enough, given the circumstances." Elena crossed her arms, studying him with the same careful scrutiny he seemed to be giving her. "I have a great many questions, Damien Ashgrove, and I would appreciate honest answers, given that you now apparently own the rights to my presence." "I told you last night," he said, something almost like patience in his tone. "You are not owned. But I understand your skepticism, and I intend to answer whatever you ask, as truthfully as I am able." "Then let's start simply. Why did your guards bow to you last night, as though you were royalty? Why does your housekeeper speak of you like you're something more than a wealthy landowner? What exactly is this place, and what exactly are you?" Something shifted in Damien's expression, a weighing, careful consideration, as though he were deciding how much truth a single morning could reasonably hold. "Those are fair questions," he said slowly, "and they deserve real answers. But some truths are easier shown than explained. Walk with me a while first. There are things about this house, and about the people in it, that I would rather you observe before I ask you to simply believe me." Elena hesitated, torn between frustration at yet another delay and a growing, undeniable curiosity about the strange, careful world she had woken up inside. Finally she nodded, falling into step beside him as they moved deeper into the garden, the morning sun warm on her shoulders, while somewhere beneath the surface of this beautiful, peaceful place, a much larger and far stranger truth waited patiently for her to discover it. They walked in silence for a while, past hedges trimmed with careful precision, past a small orchard heavy with early fruit, until they reached a low stone wall marking the edge of the formal gardens. Beyond it, dense forest stretched out toward distant hills, dark green and seemingly endless. "This land has belonged to my family for longer than most kingdoms have existed," Damien said finally, resting his hands on the stone wall. "We have always kept to ourselves, mostly. It's safer that way, for reasons I'll explain in time. But the world beyond these walls does not entirely forget us, and last night, at that auction, I had reason to intervene directly, rather than send someone in my place. Because of Victor Kane," Elena guessed. "Because of what Victor Kane represents," Damien corrected. "He is a small piece of something larger, a network that trades in desperation, in people who have run out of options. That network has crossed paths with my family's interests before, in ways I won't go into this morning. When I learned your name was on his list, I made the decision to end that particular transaction myself." "My name," Elena repeated slowly. "You knew who I was before the auction." Damien's jaw tightened slightly, the first crack of genuine discomfort she had seen in him. "I knew a family in your village had fallen into debt with Kane's network. I did not know it would be you, specifically, until I saw you on that platform. Elena studied his face, searching for the lie she half expected to find there, but saw only careful honesty, the kind of truth a man gives reluctantly, because he respects the person hearing it too much to offer anything less. "There's more you're not telling me," she said, "about this place, about what your guards see when they look at you." "Yes," Damien admitted, "there is considerably more, and you deserve to know all of it. But some truths, Elena, change everything about how a person sees the world, and I would rather you have a little more time to trust me, even slightly, before I ask you to accept something most people spend their entire lives never learning even exists." The wind moved through the trees beyond the wall, carrying with it a low, distant sound that might have been an animal call, or might have been something else entirely, something that made the fine hairs on Elena's arms rise, without her fully understanding why. Damien's gaze flicked toward the forest, sharp and alert for just a moment, before returning to her with careful composure restored. "Come," he said. "There's a great deal of this house you haven't seen yet. Let me show you more, and perhaps understanding will come easier than explaining." Elena followed him back toward the estate, unaware that within the coming days, the careful, patient unveiling of Damien's world would arrive far sooner than either of them expected, forced into the open by circumstances neither of them could control. Over the following days, Elena settled into a strange rhythm inside the estate, one built from equal parts comfort and unease. Margaret kept her occupied with small tasks and gentle conversation, careful never to answer questions about Damien too directly, always redirecting with a practiced smile that told Elena more about the household's guarded nature than any words could have. The staff treated her with polite warmth, yet she often caught them exchanging glances when they thought she wasn't looking, quick, meaningful looks that spoke of secrets too large for casual mention. She began to notice small things, details that on their own seemed unremarkable, but together painted a picture she could not quite piece into focus. The guards patrolling the grounds moved with an alertness that seemed almost unnatural, senses sharper than any soldier she had ever seen in her village. More than once, she caught a guard's head turning toward a sound long before it reached her own ears, as though he had heard something from a great distance away. One afternoon, while walking near the edge of the eastern woods, Elena heard raised voices coming from a clearing just beyond the tree line. Curiosity, and perhaps a touch of restlessness after days of careful confinement to the manicured gardens, drew her closer. She found a narrow gap in the hedges and peered through, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Two men stood in the clearing, stripped to the waist, facing each other in what appeared to be some kind of training exercise. As she watched, one of them moved with a speed that seemed to blur the edges of her vision, closing the distance between them in less than a heartbeat. The other reacted just as fast, and for a moment, in a trick of the afternoon light, Elena could have sworn she saw something shift across his face, a darkening around the eyes, a sharpening of the jaw, gone again, before she could be certain she had seen it at all. She stepped back from the hedge, her heart pounding, telling herself it had been a trick of light and shadow, nothing more. But the image stayed with her for the rest of the day, resurfacing every time she closed her eyes. That evening, she found Damien in the estate's library, a vast room lined floor to ceiling with books, many of them old enough that their leather bindings had begun to crack with age. He looked up from a document he had been reading as she entered, setting it aside with the careful, deliberate motion of a man accustomed to controlling exactly how much of himself he revealed to others. "You look troubled," he observed. "I saw something today," Elena said, choosing to be direct rather than dance around the subject. "In the eastern woods, two men training, and for a moment, I thought I saw—" She hesitated, aware of how absurd the words would sound spoken aloud. "I don't know what I saw. Something that didn't look entirely human." Damien went very still, his expression carefully neutral, in a way that told her more than an outright reaction would have. "The light plays tricks in those woods," he said, "especially in late afternoon." "That's not an answer." "No," he admitted. "It isn't." Elena crossed the room and sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap, refusing to be dismissed with another vague deflection. "I've been here 6 days, Damien. Your guards move like nothing I've ever seen. Your staff whisper about you, like you're something to be feared as much as respected. And now I've seen something in your own woods that defies every explanation I can come up with. I think it's time you told me the truth, whatever it is. I would rather know, even if it frightens me, than keep guessing in the dark." For a long moment, Damien said nothing, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to hold his gaze. Finally, he exhaled slowly, and something in his posture shifted, as though he had been carrying a great weight and had finally decided to set at least part of it down. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've delayed longer than I should have, telling myself I was protecting you by waiting, when really, I think I was protecting myself from watching your face change once you knew." He paused, gathering his thoughts with visible effort. "What you saw in the woods was not a trick of light." Elena's pulse quickened, though she kept her voice steady. "Then what was it?" "There are things in this world," Damien said slowly, "that most people never encounter, never even suspect exist, because those of us who carry them work very hard to keep it that way. What you saw today, the speed, the shift in his features, that was a man showing a glimpse of a nature that runs far deeper than his human form suggests." "You're speaking in riddles," Elena said, though a cold, creeping certainty was beginning to settle into her chest, some instinct recognizing the shape of the truth even before he said the words outright. "My family," Damien said, meeting her eyes directly now, "and everyone who serves in this household, are not entirely human. We carry a second nature, one that has existed alongside humanity, since long before recorded history, hidden, guarded, passed down through bloodlines that stretch back further than anyone can properly trace. We are what old stories once called shifters, wolves, specifically, in my family's case." Elena stared at him, waiting for some sign that this was an elaborate joke, some crack in his expression that would reveal the absurdity of what he had just said. But his face remained solemn, steady, entirely serious, and slowly, piece by piece, the strange details of the past 6 days began arranging themselves into a shape that suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. "The guards," she said slowly. "The way they move, the way they seem to hear things before anyone else could." "Enhanced senses," Damien confirmed. "Strength, speed, hearing, all considerably beyond what an ordinary person possesses. It comes with the nature we carry." "And you," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Are you the same?" Damien held her gaze steadily. "Yes, though what I carry runs somewhat deeper than what you'll find among most of my household." "Deeper how?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Elena had the distinct sense that whatever he said next would change everything, that this careful, gradual unveiling had reached its final threshold, and there would be no returning to the comfortable ignorance of the past 6 days. "That," Damien said finally, "is a conversation better suited for tomorrow, when the sun is up, and you've had time to sit with what I've already told you tonight. I know this is a great deal to absorb, Elena. I don't expect you to simply accept it without time to think." Elena sat back in her chair, her mind spinning through everything she had just learned, every strange detail of the past week, rearranging itself into new and unsettling patterns. Fear pulsed through her, sharp and immediate, but beneath it, something else stirred as well, a curiosity she could not quite suppress, a growing awareness that the world was far larger and far stranger than she had ever imagined, and that she now stood, however unwillingly, at the edge of that larger world. "I need air," she said finally, rising from her chair. Damien nodded, understanding evident in his expression. "Of course. Take whatever time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to talk further." Elena left the library and walked out into the cool night air, her thoughts racing faster than she could organize them. Above her, the stars stretched across a clear sky, indifferent to the impossible truths unfolding beneath them, and somewhere in the eastern woods, a low howl rose into the darkness, distant and haunting, a sound that no longer seemed quite as ordinary as it had a week ago. She stood there for a long time, breathing in the cold air, trying to reconcile the world she thought she knew with the far stranger one she had just glimpsed. Whatever came next, she understood now, would require a kind of courage she had not yet been asked to summon, a willingness to accept truths that defied everything she had once believed possible. Tomorrow, Damien had said, there would be more. And somewhere beneath her fear, Elena found herself bracing not just for fear of the unknown, but for the strange, unshakable feeling that the deepest truth of all was still waiting, just beyond the edge of what she had learned tonight. Morning came slowly, gray light creeping across Elena's ceiling, long before she found the will to rise. She had barely slept, her mind circling endlessly through the conversation in the library, through half-remembered village stories about wolves that walked like men, tales she had always dismissed as superstition, meant to frighten children into staying close to home after dark. Now those same stories sat heavy in her chest, no longer distant fiction, but something living just beyond her bedroom door. She dressed slowly and made her way down to the garden, where a note from Margaret had directed her to meet Damien once she was ready. She found him waiting by the same stone fountain as before, dressed simply, his expression carrying the particular stillness of a man who had also spent a long night thinking. "You didn't sleep," he observed as she approached. "Neither did you, from the look of it," she answered. A faint, almost rueful smile touched his lips. "No. I imagine we were both turning the same conversation over in our minds, for very different reasons." Elena sat on the low stone bench near the fountain, folding her hands in her lap. "You said there was more, about what you are, something deeper than the rest of your household." Damien took a slow breath, and Elena watched him gather himself, watched the careful composure he wore like armor settle more firmly into place before he spoke. "What I am about to tell you," he said, "is known to very few people outside this estate, and those who do know understand the danger of speaking it carelessly. I ask that whatever you decide about me, about this place, you keep what I tell you here between us, at least until you understand the reasons for that caution." "I'm not in the habit of betraying confidences," Elena said, "especially not to a man who saved my father from ruin and gave me a roof over my head, whatever strangeness comes attached to it." Something in Damien's shoulders eased slightly at that, though the tension in his jaw remained. "There are shifter families scattered across many territories," he began. "Most live quietly, keeping to small communities, avoiding notice from the human world as much as possible. But among those families, there has always been a single bloodline set apart from the rest, one carrying authority over all the others, a line stretching back countless generations." Elena felt a strange stillness settle over her, some instinct warning her that the next words would be the ones that changed everything. "That authority is currently held by my family," Damien continued. "By me, specifically. I am what my people call the Alpha King. Every shifter pack across this territory, and several beyond it, answers to my authority, whether they welcome that arrangement or not. It is the reason my guards move the way they do when they see me, the reason Margaret speaks of me with such careful respect. It is not simply deference to wealth, Elena. It is deference to a bond woven into the very nature they carry, one that recognizes my authority on an instinctive level, whether they wish to acknowledge it consciously or not." Elena sat in stunned silence, trying to fit this new information into everything she thought she understood about the world. A king, not a title of ceremony or symbolic honor, but something real, something that commanded obedience on a level she could barely comprehend, hidden entirely from the human world she had grown up in. Why, she finally managed, would a king attend an auction himself? Why not send someone else to handle Victor Kane's network, someone less important, less exposed to risk? "Because Kane's network has grown bold enough to threaten the safety of my people," Damien said, his voice hardening slightly. "Some of the individuals sold through his auctions are not entirely human either, though their sellers rarely realize what they've stumbled into. Kane has, whether he understands it or not, been trading in lives connected to my authority, and that is not something I could allow to continue through intermediaries. Some matters require the king to act directly, so the message is heard clearly by everyone watching. And I was simply caught in the middle of that message," Elena said slowly, feeling something cold settle in her chest. "You didn't buy my freedom because of who I am. You bought it to make a point." "That was my reasoning when I first saw you on that platform," Damien admitted, and there was something raw in his honesty that surprised her, a willingness to give her the harder truth rather than a comfortable lie. "But it is no longer the whole of my reasoning, Elena, and I would be doing you a disservice to pretend otherwise." "What do you mean?" Damien hesitated, and for the first time since she had met him, Elena saw something like uncertainty cross his features, an emotion that seemed entirely foreign to a man who commanded absolute authority over his people. "There is a concept among shifters," he said carefully, something we call a bond of fate. It is rare, rarer than most stories suggest, and it cannot be forced or chosen. It simply happens, sometimes, between two people whose nature recognizes something essential in one another. I felt something the moment I saw you on that platform, something I have never felt before, not in 32 years of life. I do not fully understand it yet myself, and I did not wish to burden you with the weight of it before you had even come to terms with the basic truth of who and what I am. Elena's heart pounded, a strange mixture of fear and something else entirely, something she could not yet name, moving through her chest. You're saying you believe I am somehow fated to you. I am saying I don't yet know, Damien said honestly. Only that something drew me to intervene that night, beyond simple duty, and that the feeling has not faded in the days since. I would rather tell you this plainly than let you discover it slowly, and wonder why I kept it from you. The garden fell silent, except for the soft trickle of the fountain, and Elena sat with the weight of everything she had learned in the past 2 days. A truth so far outside anything she had ever imagined, that part of her mind still wanted to reject it entirely, to insist this was all some elaborate dream she would wake from any moment. But the steady, careful honesty in Damien's expression, the strange details she had witnessed with her own eyes, left little room for doubt. I need time, she said finally. This is a great deal to accept all at once. My father sold to cover a debt, an auction, a king who rules over people who can become something other than human, and now you're telling me some invisible bond may connect the two of us. I am one woman from a small village, Damien. I don't know how to hold all of this at once. You don't have to hold it all at once, Damien said gently. Take whatever time you need. I am not asking you to accept anything beyond what you're ready for. I only wanted you to have the truth, rather than continue guessing in the dark. Elena nodded slowly, grateful, despite everything, for his patience. She rose from the bench and walked a slow circuit around the fountain, trying to steady the chaos of her thoughts, while Damien remained seated, watching her with quiet, careful attention, giving her the space she needed without pressing further. As she walked, a new thought settled uncomfortably into her mind, one that had nothing to do with bonds or fate, and everything to do with the practical dangers of the truth she now carried. If this bloodline of yours, this authority, is meant to be kept secret from most people, she said slowly, turning back to face him, what happens to someone like me, who now knows the truth? Does that put me in danger? Damien's expression sobered instantly, the careful stillness returning to his features. Yes, he admitted, it does. There are those who would see knowledge like this as a weakness to exploit, a way to reach me through you. That is part of why I hesitated to tell you everything so quickly. I did not want to hand you a danger alongside the truth. Then perhaps, Elena said quietly, you should have let me keep wondering. Perhaps, Damien agreed. But I have found, in my experience, that people protected by ignorance are rarely protected for long. I would rather you understand the danger clearly, so you can help guard against it, than leave you unaware and vulnerable to threats you don't even know exist. Elena considered this, and found, despite everything, a grudging respect for his reasoning, however unsettling the implications. Whatever else Damien Ashgrove was, king, wolf, stranger who had upended her entire understanding of the world in the span of a single week, he seemed determined to treat her as someone capable of handling hard truths, rather than someone to be sheltered and managed. It was, she realized, more respect than most people in her life had ever shown her, and that realization alone was enough to soften some of the fear still tightening her chest. I still need time, she said again, though her voice carried less resistance now than before. Take it, Damien said simply. I'll be here. Elena left the garden that morning, carrying a weight far heavier than the one she had arrived with a week ago. Yet somewhere beneath the fear and uncertainty, a small, stubborn seed of curiosity had begun to take root. A question she was not yet ready to answer but could no longer ignore. What might it mean, exactly, to be bonded to a king who ruled a world she had never known existed until 7 days ago? Weeks passed at the estate, and Elena found herself settling into a rhythm she never expected to feel comfortable within, given how strange her arrival had been. She spent mornings walking the gardens, afternoons in the library reading books on shifter history that Damien quietly left within her reach, and evenings sharing meals with him in a smaller dining room he preferred over the grand formal hall, conversations that grew easier and longer with each passing day. She learned that his people called their community a pack, though the pack under his direct authority was only the smallest piece of a much larger network of packs spread across the wider territory, each led by its own alpha, all of them ultimately answerable to him. She learned that shifters age differently than humans, in some respects, that their strength and senses were tied closely to their emotional state, sharper when angry or afraid, and that the bond he had described to her, the fated connection, was spoken of among his people, with a kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred things. She also learned, slowly and through careful observation, rather than direct explanation, that being the Alpha King came with burdens Damien rarely spoke of openly. Messengers arrived at odd hours, carrying reports that left him tense and distracted for hours afterward. Council meetings with pack representatives from distant territories stretched late into the night, voices sometimes raised behind closed doors before falling into careful, measured silence. Whatever peace the estate offered on its surface, Elena began to understand that Damien carried responsibilities heavy enough to bend a lesser man entirely. One evening, after a particularly long council session, she found him alone in the garden, sitting on the low stone bench where they had first spoken openly about his true nature. He looked tired in a way she had not seen before, shoulders slightly bowed, staring at nothing in particular. "Bad news?" she asked, settling beside him without waiting for an invitation, a familiarity that had grown naturally between them over the past weeks. "Complicated news," Damien said, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "There are factions among the packs who resent centralized authority, who believe individual packs should govern themselves entirely, without answering to a single ruler. It is an old argument, older than my own rule, and it flares up periodically no matter how carefully I try to manage it. Do you agree with them, even a little?" Damien considered the question seriously, which Elena had come to appreciate about him, his refusal to dismiss even uncomfortable questions without genuine thought. "There is wisdom in some of what they argue," he admitted. "Unchecked authority is dangerous, regardless of who holds it, but there is also wisdom in unity, in having a single voice, capable of protecting all packs, from threats too large for any single group to handle alone. Threats like Victor Kane's network, which preys on shifters and humans alike without distinction. I try to hold both truths at once. It is not always easy." Elena studied his profile in the fading evening light, struck by how different this quiet, weary version of him felt from the composed, commanding figure who had swept her away from that auction hall weeks ago. "You carry a great deal," she said softly. "More than I think anyone here truly appreciates." Something shifted in his expression at her words, a flicker of surprise, as though he had not expected such simple understanding from her. "You're the first person in a long while to say that, without wanting something from me in return," he said quietly. "I don't want anything from you," Elena said, and found, saying it aloud, that it was entirely true. Whatever fear and confusion she had carried in those first days had softened into something else over the past weeks, something she was still hesitant to name, but which no longer felt like fear at all. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the garden settling into the deep blue hush of early evening, until Damien spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "May I ask you something honestly, Elena, and trust you'll answer just as honestly in return?" "Of course." "Do you still see yourself as a debt paid, a woman purchased to settle an account, or has something shifted in these past weeks?" Elena considered the question carefully, aware of how much weight it carried, aware that her answer would shape whatever came next between them. "In the beginning," she said slowly, "yes. I felt like property, with a kinder owner, even when you told me otherwise. But these past weeks, watching you, talking with you, learning what your world truly asks of you, I no longer see it that way. I don't fully understand what this bond of yours means, or what it might ask of me. But I no longer feel like something purchased, Damien. I feel like someone you actually see." Damien turned to look at her fully then, something warm and unguarded moving across his features, an expression she had not seen from him before, stripped of the careful composure he wore for his household and his counsel alike. "I am glad," he said simply, "because I have felt the truth of that bond growing stronger every day since you arrived, and I did not wish to speak of it again until I was certain you felt something real as well, rather than simply gratitude for your circumstances." "I feel something real," Elena admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, surprised by how easily the words came once she allowed herself to say them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with something new and fragile, something neither of them seemed quite ready to name aloud, but which had clearly been building steadily beneath the surface of every conversation, every shared meal, every quiet evening in the garden over the past weeks. Damien reached over slowly and took her hand, his fingers warm and careful around hers, and Elena did not pull away. "I want you to understand something," he said quietly. "Whatever grows between us from here, I will never treat you as anything less than an equal. Not a debt paid, not property, not a political convenience. You will always have the right to choose your own path, even where I am concerned." "That means more to me than I think you realize," Elena said, and meant it fully, thinking of her father's helpless grief on the night she left home, thinking of the auction platform, and the cold, evaluating eyes of the crowd, thinking of how far she had traveled, in every sense, from that terrifying night to this quiet, warm moment in the garden. Yet even as the warmth of the evening settled around them, Elena could not entirely shake a lingering unease, a sense that the world beyond this peaceful garden had not finished with either of them yet. Somewhere beyond the estate walls, Victor Kane's network continued its dark business, and somewhere among the packs whose loyalty Damien worked so carefully to hold, factions still murmured resentment against his rule. Whatever fragile happiness was beginning to bloom between them, Elena understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain beneath her growing affection, that it would not go unchallenged for long. She was right to worry. Even as she sat beside Damien in the quiet garden, watching the last light fade from the sky, messengers were already riding hard toward the estate, carrying news that would soon shatter the fragile peace they had both begun, however cautiously, to hope for. The messenger arrived just after midnight, his horse lathered with sweat, his voice hoarse from riding hard across the territory without rest. Elena woke to the sound of raised voices echoing up from the main hall, sharp and urgent, in a way that sent a jolt of alarm through her chest, even before she understood the words being spoken. She dressed quickly and hurried down the corridor, arriving just as Damien stepped out of the hall, his expression tight, with a controlled anger she had never seen from him before. "What's happened?" she asked, catching his arm. "Victor Kane," Damien said, his jaw tight. "He's discovered who I am. Not simply that I purchased you, but the full truth of my identity. Someone within his network has connections deeper than I anticipated, and he intends to use that knowledge." Elena's stomach dropped. "Use it how?" "He's threatening to expose my identity publicly," Damien said, "to human authorities and to rival packs alike, unless certain demands are met. He believes he can force my hand, force me to pay whatever price he sets to keep his silence. And he has made it clear that if I refuse, he will not hesitate to make good on the threat." "Can he actually prove any of it?" "Proof matters less than exposure," Damien said grimly. "Even unproven rumors of my identity reaching the wrong ears could destabilize the fragile trust I've built among the packs. Factions already resentful of centralized authority would seize on any weakness, real or perceived, to challenge my rule. And if human authorities began investigating claims of shifters living openly among them, the consequences would be far worse than anything Kane could imagine, for shifters and humans both." Elena felt the weight of the danger settling over her, understanding now, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, exactly how much had shifted in the weeks since her arrival, how her presence in Damien's life had become a thread Kane clearly intended to pull. "This is because of me," she said quietly. "Because you bought my freedom, and it drew attention that otherwise would have stayed hidden." "This is because of Kane's greed," Damien corrected firmly. "Not because of anything you did. I made the choice to intervene that night, and I do not regret it, regardless of what consequences follow." Margaret appeared then, her expression grave, carrying a folded letter that she handed to Damien without a word. He read it quickly, his expression darkening further with each line. "He's requesting a meeting," Damien said finally, 3 days from now, at neutral ground near the northern border. "He wants to negotiate terms directly." "That sounds like a trap," Elena said immediately. "It very likely is," Damien agreed. "But refusing outright risks him following through on his threat immediately, without any chance to contain the damage. I need to at least appear willing to negotiate, Buy enough time to understand exactly what he knows and how he intends to use it. Over the following 2 days, the estate transformed around Elena into something closer to a war council than the quiet, peaceful home she had grown accustomed to. Damien met continuously with trusted advisors, planning every possible outcome of the coming confrontation, while guards doubled their patrols along the estate's borders, tension thick enough that even the household staff moved through their duties with visible unease. Elena insisted on being included in these discussions, refusing to be sidelined from a danger that had followed her as much as it followed Damien. He resisted at first, worried for her safety, but eventually relented when she pointed out, with more steel in her voice than she had known she possessed, that she had already survived an auction hall full of predatory strangers and had no intention of hiding quietly while decisions about her own safety were made entirely without her input. "If Kane exposes the truth," she asked, during one such meeting, "what exactly happens? Walk me through the worst outcome." "Chaos," one of Damien's advisors answered grimly, a broad-shouldered man named Owen who had served as Damien's closest confidant for years. Rival packs would see confirmed vulnerability as an opportunity to challenge the current order. Some might attempt to seize territory by force. Human authorities, if they believed the claims credible, could launch investigations that would endanger shifter communities who have lived peacefully among humans for generations, entirely blameless in whatever conflict Kane stirs up. "And Kane himself," Elena pressed. "What does he actually gain from exposing you, beyond whatever price he might extract before doing so?" Damien and Owen exchanged a look, and Elena caught something pass between them, a realization neither had fully articulated until her question forced it into the open. "Chaos benefits men like Kane," Damien said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. "A destabilized territory, packs fighting among themselves, human authorities distracted by shifter investigations. It creates exactly the kind of confusion where his network could expand unchecked, free from the order I've worked to maintain. He may not intend to simply extract payment and vanish. He may intend to burn the entire structure down and profit from the wreckage. Then negotiating with him at all may be pointless," Elena said. "If chaos is his actual goal, no amount of payment will satisfy him for long." The room fell silent as the full weight of this realization settled over everyone present. Owen was the first to speak, his voice grim. "If that's true, then the meeting in 3 days isn't a negotiation at all. It's a trap meant to draw you out, away from the estate's defenses, into territory Kane controls." Damien's expression hardened into something Elena had not seen from him before, a cold, focused resolve that reminded her, suddenly and forcefully, exactly what kind of man commanded absolute authority over an entire network of packs. "Then we don't walk into his trap as he expects," he said. "We prepare for exactly what he intends, and we make certain that whatever he has planned for that meeting, he finds himself considerably more outmatched than he anticipates." Elena watched him transform in that moment, from the quiet, thoughtful man she had grown close to over the past weeks, into something sharper, more commanding, a ruler, preparing to defend everything and everyone under his protection. It was, she realized with a strange mixture of fear and something close to awe, the first time she had truly seen the Alpha King in full, rather than the careful, restrained version of himself he had shown her in the garden. "I want to come with you," she said, before she had fully decided to say it aloud. The room turned to look at her, several expressions carrying open alarm at the suggestion. Damien's face, however, showed something more complicated, a flash of protective instinct, warring visibly, with something that looked almost like respect. "Absolutely not," he said. "Kane's entire goal may be to use you against me, Elena. Walking directly into that danger would hand him exactly what he wants." "Or," Elena countered, refusing to back down, "my presence forces him to show his true intentions faster, since he clearly believes I hold some value to you worth exploiting. Either way, hiding me here does nothing to guarantee my safety, if his plan succeeds regardless. I would rather face this danger directly, at your side, than wait helplessly for whatever comes after." The debate continued late into the night, voices rising and falling around the question of how best to meet the threat Kane posed, while outside the estate walls, the borders of Damien's territory braced quietly for a confrontation that would test everything he had built, and everything Elena had begun, however cautiously, to hope for. In the end, a compromise was reached. though it satisfied no one entirely. Elena would accompany the party toward the northern border, but she would remain concealed at a safe distance from the actual meeting point, close enough that Damien's people could reach her quickly if needed, far enough that she would not be directly exposed to whatever danger the confrontation with Cain might bring. Owen would lead a group of the estate's most trusted guards to watch over her, while Damien rode ahead, with a smaller escort to the meeting itself. The journey north took the better part of 2 days, traveling through increasingly wild countryside as they left the cultivated lands surrounding the estate behind. Elena rode in a covered wagon alongside Owen, who spoke little, but watched everything around them with the same restless alertness she had come to recognize among Damien's most trusted people. "You care for him," Owen said at one point, breaking the long silence between them as they rode through a narrow forest pass. It was not quite a question. Elena considered how to answer honestly. "I do," she admitted, "more than I expected to, given how strangely this all began." Owen nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "He hasn't been the same since you arrived. Lighter, somehow, even carrying all the weight he does. Whatever this bond between you truly is, I've watched it change him, and not in small ways." "Has he had others?" Elena asked, curiosity getting the better of her caution. "Before me. Someone he considered for this bond, or something close to it." "Never like this," Owen said simply. "There have been women who wanted his position, his power, and a few he genuinely cared for over the years, but I've never seen him settle the way he has around you. It's rare, this fated bond he speaks of, rarer than most people realize. I've served him for nearly 15 years, and never once seen him affected by it before now." Elena absorbed this quietly, watching the dense trees roll past the wagon's canvas opening, thinking of everything Owen's words implied about the depth of what was growing between herself and Damien, and about how much both of them stood to lose if Cain's scheme succeeded in the coming confrontation. They made camp that evening a safe distance from the meeting point, a clearing near a shallow stream where Damien and his smaller escort would continue on alone the following morning. That night, Damien found Elena sitting alone near the edge of the camp, staring up at a sky thick with stars, far brighter here than anything visible from the estate's gardens. "You should be resting," he said, settling beside her without invitation, a familiarity that had become natural between them over the preceding weeks. "I couldn't sleep," Elena admitted, "not with tomorrow waiting." Damien was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the same distant stars she had been studying. "I need you to promise me something," he said finally. "If tomorrow goes badly, if something happens to prevent me from returning, you follow Owen's instructions without hesitation. You get back to the estate, and you let the council there protect you, and continue the order I've worked to build. Don't try to be brave in a way that puts you in further danger." "Don't talk like that," Elena said, a sharp edge of fear cutting through her voice, despite her best efforts to remain composed. "You're not going to fail tomorrow." "I don't intend to," Damien said, "but I would be foolish not to prepare for every possibility, and I need to know you'll be safe regardless of what happens." Elena reached over and took his hand, holding it tightly, as though the simple physical connection could somehow anchor him against whatever danger waited in the coming hours. "I promise," she said quietly, "but only if you promise me something in return. Come back. Whatever happens tomorrow, come back to me." Damien turned to look at her fully, something raw and unguarded moving across his features in the dim firelight. "I intend to spend a great deal of effort making certain of exactly that," he said, and leaned forward, resting his forehead gently against hers, a gesture more intimate somehow than any words could have been. They sat together like that for a long while, the fire crackling softly nearby, the sounds of the forest settling around them, two people bracing themselves for whatever the following day might bring, drawing whatever strength they could from each other in the quiet dark before the storm. Morning arrived too quickly. Damien rode out at first light with his small escort, disappearing into the mist, clinging low over the northern hills, while Elena watched from the edge of camp until the trees swallowed the last glimpse of him from view. Owen moved through the remaining camp with quiet efficiency, positioning the guards who remained, watching the surrounding forest with sharp, careful eyes. The hours that followed stretched impossibly long. Elena paced the edges of the camp, unable to sit still, her mind cycling endlessly through every possible outcome of the meeting, taking place somewhere beyond the hills. Around midday, one of the guards posted at the camp's edge suddenly straightened, his head turning sharply toward the northern tree line, nostrils flaring in a way that reminded Elena, uncomfortably, of an animal catching an unfamiliar scent on the wind. "Something's wrong," he said quietly to Owen, who immediately moved to his side, his own expression sharpening into focused alertness. "How many?" Owen asked. "Hard to say. More than expected, and I smell blood." Elena's heart lurched painfully in her chest. "We need to go, now." "Absolutely not," Owen said firmly. "My orders are to keep you safe here, away from whatever is happening. If Damien needs support, others are positioned to provide it. Running toward danger blindly helps no one." Elena wanted to argue, every instinct screaming at her to move, to do something, anything, rather than stand helplessly waiting for news that might never come, or might come far too late. But she forced herself to remain still, gripping the edge of the wagon so tightly her knuckles turned white, watching the northern tree line with desperate, straining focus, praying for some sign, any sign, that Damien would emerge from those trees unharmed. The wait stretched on, each passing minute feeling like an hour, until finally, as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, movement flickered at the edge of the trees. Elena's breath caught, hope and terror warring violently in her chest, as she strained to make out the approaching figures, unable yet to tell whether they carried news of victory, or something far worse. The figures emerging from the tree line resolved slowly into familiar shapes, and Elena's heart nearly stopped when she recognized Damien's escort among them, several men moving slowly, supporting one another, clear signs of a hard-fought struggle visible in torn clothing, and careful, pained movements. Her eyes searched desperately through the group until she found him, walking under his own strength, though favoring one side, a dark stain of blood visible along his sleeve. "Damien!" She was moving before she fully realized it, crossing the camp at a run, ignoring Owen's sharp warning behind her. Damien looked up at the sound of her voice, and despite the exhaustion and pain etched clearly across his face, something in his expression softened with relief at the sight of her. "I'm all right," he said as she reached him, catching her hands before she could touch the wound at his shoulder. "It looks worse than it is." "What happened?" Elena demanded, her eyes taking in the full extent of the group's injuries, the grim, tense expressions on every face. "Kane never intended to negotiate," Damien said grimly. "The meeting was exactly the trap we suspected. He had men positioned throughout the surrounding forest, more than our scouts detected beforehand. It was a difficult fight, but we managed to break through his ambush." "And Kane himself?" Damien's expression darkened further. "Escaped, along with a handful of his men. We inflicted significant losses on his network today, but he remains at large, and considerably more dangerous now that his direct attempt has failed. He'll know we anticipated at least part of his plan, which means whatever he attempts next will likely be far more carefully considered." Owen moved quickly to organize immediate care for the wounded, and within the hour, the camp had transformed into a makeshift healing station, guards tending each other's injuries with the same brisk efficiency they had shown in battle. Elena insisted on helping clean and bind Damien's wound herself, her hands steady, despite the fear still hammering through her chest. "You shouldn't have run toward danger like that," Damien said quietly as she worked, wincing slightly as she cleaned the gash along his shoulder. "I asked you to stay safe. And I promised I would, if you promised to come back," Elena said, not looking up from her work. "You came back. I'm allowed a moment of relief that overrides good sense." A tired smile touched his lips, despite the pain evident in his expression. "Fair enough." That evening, as the camp settled into an uneasy rest, Damien called a quiet council with Owen and his other senior guards, working through what the failed ambush meant for the days ahead. Elena sat close by, no longer questioned about her presence in these discussions, her earlier insistence on inclusion having proven its worth through the sharp, practical questions she continued to raise. "Kane knows now that direct confrontation carries too much risk," Damien said. "He'll shift tactics, something less direct, more difficult to anticipate. He might try to reach the packs directly," Owen suggested grimly. "Stir up the factions, already resentful of your authority, offer them information or resources in exchange for open rebellion. If he can't destabilize you through exposure or ambush, he may try to destabilize you through division instead." The thought settled heavily over the group, and Elena watched Damien's expression grow more troubled as he considered the implications. That would be considerably harder to counter, he admitted. A battle I can fight, whispered doubt spreading through packs already inclined toward resentment. That's a different kind of war entirely. Then perhaps, Elena said slowly, an idea forming as she spoke. The answer is to address that resentment directly, rather than simply defending against whatever Cain might exploit. If the factions doubt centralized authority, show them something worth trusting rather than simply demanding their loyalty through inherited position alone. The group turned to look at her, and she continued, encouraged by the thoughtful silence rather than dismissal. You said yourself there's wisdom in some of what the factions argue. What if you met with their leaders directly, openly acknowledged their concerns, worked toward some kind of compromise that addresses genuine grievances rather than simply asserting authority over them? It would remove much of the fuel Cain might otherwise use to stir rebellion. Damien considered this carefully, and Owen nodded slowly beside him, clearly turning the idea over with genuine interest. It would require considerable trust building, Damien said, and no small risk, meeting openly with factions who have questioned my authority. Perhaps, Elena said, but continuing to rule purely through inherited authority, without addressing genuine concerns, leaves exactly the kind of vulnerability Cain intends to exploit. Strength built on trust is harder to undermine than strength built on obedience alone. A long silence followed her words, and Elena wondered briefly if she had overstepped, offering counsel on matters of governance that were, by any reasonable standard, well beyond her place in this world. But Damien's expression, when he finally spoke, carried something closer to admiration than offense. You continue to surprise me, he said quietly. That is precisely the kind of wisdom I have been missing in my own counsel these past years. Too close to the problem to see past my own assumptions about how authority ought to function. He turned to Owen. Send word ahead to the pack leaders. I want to arrange a gathering, as soon as it can reasonably be organized. It's time to address these tensions directly, rather than simply managing them from a distance. As the council dispersed to begin the practical work of arranging such a gathering, Damien remained beside Elena a while longer, studying her with an expression that carried equal parts affection and quiet wonder. You didn't have to offer that counsel, he said. You could have simply stayed quiet, let the matter rest with those of us accustomed to such decisions. I care what happens to you, Elena said simply, and to the people depending on you to lead them well. That matters enough to me, that staying quiet was never really an option. Damien reached over and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering a moment longer than necessary. I am fortunate, he said softly. Far more fortunate than I think I properly understood, that night at the auction, when I chose to intervene. Elena felt warmth spreading through her chest, despite the exhaustion and danger of the day behind them. A growing certainty settling into place, alongside the fear that still lingered from the day's events. Whatever came next, whatever Cain attempted in the days ahead, she understood now that she was no longer simply a woman, rescued from an impossible circumstance. She had become something else entirely, a voice Damien trusted, a partner in the difficult work of holding his fractured world together, and that realization, however daunting, filled her with a quiet, steady resolve she had not known she possessed until this journey forced it into the open. The gathering of pack leaders took place 2 weeks later, held in a wide stone hall on the estate grounds that Elena had not seen used before, its walls hung with old banners representing the various packs scattered across Damien's territory. Representatives arrived from every corner of the region, some clearly loyal to Damien without question, others carrying the guarded, skeptical expressions of those who had long questioned the value of centralized rule. Elena stood near the back of the hall as the proceedings began, watching Damien address the assembled leaders with a steadiness that belied the enormous risk he was taking, opening himself to open criticism and challenge in a way his predecessors, by all accounts, had rarely if ever done. He spoke plainly about the threat Cain's network posed, about the ambush at the northern border, and then, to the visible surprise of many in the room, about the legitimate grievances several factions had raised over the years regarding the balance of authority between the packs and the crown. I have ruled, Damien said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, believing that unity required firm, centralized authority, and in many ways, That belief has served us well against threats too large for any single pack to face alone. But I have not always listened as closely as I should have to concerns raised from within my own territory, and I believe that failure has left room for men like Victor Kane to exploit divisions that should never have been allowed to grow so deep. Murmurs moved through the assembled leaders, surprise evident on many faces at hearing such open acknowledgement from their king. One leader, an older woman representing a Western pack long known for its resistance to central authority, rose to speak. "Words are easily offered," she said, her tone carrying years of accumulated skepticism. "What changes, concretely, beyond acknowledgement?" Damien nodded, clearly having anticipated exactly this challenge. "A formal council," he said, "with representation from every pack, granted genuine authority over decisions affecting the wider territory, rather than serving merely as advisors to decisions I make alone. Not a replacement for necessary unity in the face of outside threats, but a genuine partnership in governing the matters that affect us all." The proposal sparked immediate discussion throughout the hall, voices rising in debate, some skeptical, others clearly intrigued by the possibility of a more balanced structure than they had known under previous rule. Elena watched from her place near the back, pride swelling in her chest, as she observed Damien navigate the difficult conversation, with patience and genuine openness, refusing to retreat into simple assertions of inherited authority, even when challenged directly. It was during this exchange that the doors at the rear of the hall burst open, and a guard rushed in, his expression urgent. "My lord," he said, addressing Damien directly, cutting through the ongoing debate, "Victor Kane has been sighted near the eastern border, along with a considerable force. It appears he intends to strike now, while attention is focused here." The hall fell into immediate, tense silence. Damien's expression hardened, and Elena felt her pulse quicken with a fear that had become disturbingly familiar over the preceding weeks. But before Damien could respond, the older woman who had challenged him earlier rose again, her expression now carrying something entirely different than the skepticism of moments before. "If this man threatens all our packs equally," she said, her voice firm and clear, "then perhaps this is exactly the moment to demonstrate what genuine partnership might accomplish. My pack stands ready to answer this threat alongside yours, my lord, council or no council." Other leaders rose in turn, voicing similar commitments, and Elena watched something remarkable unfold before her, the very crisis that Kane had intended to exploit for division, instead drawing the fractured packs together in common purpose. Damien's gaze swept the room, something like humbled gratitude visible beneath his composed exterior. "Then let us answer this threat together," he said, "and let today mark not simply a battle won, but the beginning of the partnership I hope we can build going forward." The combined forces moved quickly, packs that had rarely if ever coordinated directly now working alongside each other with a shared urgency that left little room for old resentments. Elena remained at the estate, though not idle, working alongside Margaret and the remaining household staff to prepare for wounded who might return from the confrontation. Her earlier promise to stay safely removed from direct danger, tempered now by a determination to be useful in whatever capacity she could manage. The battle at the eastern border, when reports finally reached the estate late that night, had gone decisively in Damien's favor. Facing a unified response from packs that had previously seemed fractured and divided, Kane's forces found themselves overwhelmed and outmatched. Kane himself was captured attempting to flee the confrontation, his network's remaining leadership scattered and broken in the aftermath. Damien returned to the estate 2 days later, weary but unharmed, and Elena met him at the entrance with a relief so profound it left her momentarily unable to speak. He crossed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, simply grateful for the shared warmth of having both survived to reach this moment. "It's over," Damien said finally, his voice muffled against her hair. "Kane's network is finished. The pack stood together in a way I never dared hope for, and I believe, genuinely believe, that whatever tensions remain can now be addressed through partnership rather than fear." In the weeks that followed, life at the estate settled into a new rhythm, one built on the foundation of hard-won trust rather than simple obedience. The formal council Damien had proposed took shape, meeting regularly, giving voice to concerns that had long simmered beneath the surface of his rule. Elena found herself, almost without realizing how it happened, becoming an integral part of that process. Her insight and steady counsel valued by pack leaders, who had initially eyed her with cautious uncertainty, but had come, over time, to respect her judgment as much as Damien's own. News eventually reached her father as well, carried by a messenger Damien sent personally, explaining as much of the truth as could safely be shared, and assuring him of Elena's continued safety and well-being. Gerald Voss wept upon receiving the letter. According to the messenger's account, relief and gratitude overwhelming him in equal measure, and within the month, Elena arranged for him to visit the estate, a reunion filled with tears and long overdue explanations that left both father and daughter changed by everything that had transpired since that terrible night the debt collectors had first arrived at their door. On a warm evening several months after the confrontation with Cain, Damien led Elena out to the garden where so much of their story together had unfolded, the same fountain trickling softly nearby, the same roses climbing the stone trellises that had reminded her, on her very first morning at the estate, of her mother's garden back home. I have spent my whole life believing that duty and personal happiness existed in separate, often conflicting spaces, Damien said, taking both her hands in his. That a king could not truly belong to himself, let alone to another person, without compromising the responsibilities placed upon him. You have taught me, these past months, how wrong that belief truly was. He knelt then, and Elena felt her breath catch, understanding immediately what was happening, even before he spoke the words that followed. Elena Voss, he said, you arrived in my life as a debt paid, a stranger caught in circumstances neither of us chose. But you have become, in the months since, the truest partner I could have imagined, someone who challenges me, strengthens me, and reminds me constantly of the kind of ruler, and the kind of man, I wish to be. I am asking you now, freely, with nothing owed and nothing purchased, if you will stand beside me not as property, not as a political convenience, but as my equal, my chosen mate, and, if you'll have me, my queen. Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, thinking of the frightened young woman who had climbed into a carriage months ago, believing her life had ended the moment her father's debt fell due, never imagining the path that terrifying night would ultimately lead her toward. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Damien, I will. He rose and pulled her close, and as their lips met beneath the soft evening light, Elena understood fully, for the first time, the true distance she had traveled since that first terrible knock on her family's door. She had arrived at this estate believing herself sold, a debt settled in flesh, but she was leaving that identity behind entirely, stepping instead into a future she had chosen freely, built not on the desperation of her father's failed harvests, but on trust earned, respect given freely, and a bond that had proven, in the end, far stronger than any price a broker could have named. The following spring, the packs gathered once more in the Great Hall, this time not for crisis or confrontation, but for celebration, as Elena Voss was formally recognized before the assembled leaders as Damien Ashgrove's chosen queen. She stood beside him, dressed not in the borrowed silk of an auction night long behind her, but in a gown of her own choosing, her chin lifted with a confidence that had grown steadily since that frightened first night, and as the assembled crowd offered their recognition, not through fear or obligation, but through genuine respect earned over months of trial and partnership, Elena understood that she had become something far greater than anything Victor Kane's auction could ever have measured. She had become exactly who she was always meant to be, chosen freely, valued completely, and finally, fully, free.